the book of Malachi in chapter 2. We were looking at the last few verses in Malachi chapter 2. And if you will remember, we saw there that the word treachery or being a traitor, that is one who makes a promise to the face and then stabs a person behind the back afterwards, occurs 3 times in that passage. And it speaks about being treacherous towards God in verse 11. That is by having idols in one's life. And then it speaks about being treacherous towards one's brother in verse 10, being treacherous towards each other. And then it speaks about being treacherous towards your wife in verse 14. And so we see there are 3 relationships mentioned there. One is our relationship with God. The other is our relationship with our fellow believers. And the third is our relationship with our marriage partner. And Malachi speaks against this unfaithfulness in relationships in these 3 areas. And we see how relevant Malachi is for our time. Remember, he was the last prophet before the first coming of Christ. John the Baptist was the forerunner of Christ, but before that, Malachi was the last prophet. And so, he has a message, a prophetic message, for those of us who are living in the days immediately preceding the second coming of Christ, because the situation in the church is very much, in Christendom, is very similar to the situation that was prevalent in Israel at the time before Christ's first coming. And so we see how there is unfaithfulness in one's relationship to God, in one's family life, and in the fellowship, in the brotherhood. And there can be many aspects to that. We considered how backbiting and gossiping and suspicion against one's marriage partner and bitter thoughts and allowing something to take the place that God should have in our life. All these are forms of treachery in these 3 areas. And these also are covered by 3 covenants. You see, there's a covenant that man makes with God. It's referred to in verse 8, a covenant relationship with God. In verse 10, it speaks of a covenant relationship with one's brother. And verse 14, it speaks of a covenant relationship with one's wife. So, all these 3 relationships are linked by a covenant. A covenant means an agreement. The thing is, we must see that this word covenant in the Bible is exactly the same today as a registered stamp paper deed signed in a registrar's court. But the thing is, most believers would be 100 times more careful about signing a stamp paper deed in a registrar's court than they are about, for example, the breaking of bread, which is a covenant with God and with one another. Marriage is a covenant. But believers are so careless when it comes to these spiritual covenants, but so careful when they come to covenants, agreements signed in a registrar's court. And there's only one reason for that, because we basically love money. And a registrar's court stamp deed may involve us financially. And therefore, because the love of money is so deeply in the flesh, we are so careful to get a lawyer to read every sentence. But when it comes to the spiritual covenant, every Tom, Dick and Harry comes to break bread without any seriousness, without any fear of God. That is the situation in Christendom today. And Malachi has a message. There's treachery there. Being a traitor to your wife, being a traitor to your brother, being a traitor to God. That's a serious thing. And it's a much greater loss than any financial loss. It's far better to shut your eyes and sign in the registrar's court than to come and break bread without judging oneself. It's a serious thing. That's the type of thing Malachi is speaking against. Treachery in the covenant. And we want to look again at this verse 15. Verse 14, it speaks about the wife of your youth. We thought a little bit about that last time. And that speaks of the fact that you chose each other when you were young. You loved one another. But now that your wife has become old and perhaps not so attractive, not so charming as she was when she was young, you are beginning to play the fool in your thoughts and with your eyes and being a traitor. Which shows, Malachi says to these people, that basically you people had only a physical interest in your wives. That is a proof of it. That when her physical charms decline through age, you are no longer interested. In other words, you never had a spiritual interest in linkage with your wife. You were drawn to her through lust, not through the love of God. And that is the condition of a lot of people in Christendom today. And that's why even a lot of married people are very unfaithful in their thoughts and with their eyes. They haven't taken this matter of a covenant relationship seriously with their wives. With registered stamp paper, they'll be very careful. But a covenant with their wives in their thoughts and their eyes, oh, they are not bothered about that. And the reason is they do not fear God. That is basically the reason. The wife of your youth. The Bible says in Proverbs 31 verse 30 that charm is deceitful and beauty is empty. But a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. There are three things you can look for in a woman according to that verse. One is beauty, the other is charm, and the third is the fear of God. If you were drawn by beauty and charm and you keep admiring beauty and charm, one day it will fade away and then you'll be a traitor to the covenant. But if you admire the fear of God, then you will be drawn to your wife even if she looks hideous. And even if there is no charm about her at all, because it's the fear of God that you are drawn to. That is the mark of a spiritual person. But there are very few spiritually minded husbands. And so they are treacherous to their wives, and God says that's a serious thing. There's a verse in 1 Thessalonians 4, verse 4 and 5, which says, 1 Thessalonians 4, verse 4 and 5. It says, every one of you should know how to possess his own vessel, or in the margin it says, that means wife. Each one of you must know how to possess his wife in sanctification and honor. How do you possess and hold on to your wife in sanctification and honor? He says, each of you should know that. And not in lustful passion. It's possible to hold on to your wife in lustful passion, like the Gentiles who do not know God. But to hold on to your wife in sanctification and honor, where your relationship with her spirit and her personality is more important than just the physical relationship. Each one of you should know that, he says. Otherwise, you're just like the heathen. Because they operate purely on the physical level like the animals. And he says, no, it must be different with you. And the other thing we see here in verse 15 of Malachi 2 is that God makes a husband and wife one so that he can have a godly offspring. God is interested in the next generation, that the next generation should be godly. Unfortunately, many parents are not so interested in that. If they were, they would do everything in their power to be one with each other. This is as far as I know, the only verse in the Bible which tells us that where there is husband and wife unity, there is a tremendous possibility of the offspring being godly. And where the offspring are not godly, where the children are not godly, the husband and wife, before blaming the children and blaming the circumstances and blaming their school friends and college friends, we are always ready like Adam to find the blame, put the blame on someone else, should perhaps humble themselves before God, the father and mother, and say, is it because the parents were not one with each other? According to this verse, that's a real possibility. No use blaming the children. Let the parents judge themselves to see whether they were suspicious and bitter and critical, and maybe the wife was unsubmissive to the husband, or the husband was dictatorial over his wife, and there was no concern or love for one another, no unity, always critical of each other's imperfections. And now we try to blame the children for being ungodly, when God says the fault is with you parents. Don't blame the children, the fault is with you. You're not one. It's easy to blame someone else. No, he has made you one. Why did he make you one? The margin of verse 15 says, because he desired a godly offspring. Therefore, all right, let's forget the past, God says. Take heed now to your spirit. In your spirit, in your thoughts, don't be treacherous to your wife. Don't be suspicious and bitter and unfaithful in your spirit, in your thoughts. Be faithful there to your wife, for I hate divorce. That was an Old Testament law. God hates divorce. It's amazing how the Pharisees who came to Jesus and asked him, why did Moses permit divorce, had never read Malachi chapter 2, verse 16. It's amazing how blind one can be to Scripture. Their hearts were hard, and so they couldn't understand what Malachi was saying. God hates divorce. In the New Testament, it says, husbands, don't even be bitter against your wife, Colossians 3:19. We could say, God says, I hate bitterness in the hearts of husbands towards their wives. I hate it. In the Old Testament, he only said, I hate divorce. A New Testament Malachi would say, God says, I hate bitterness in your heart against your wife. I hate an unsubmissive spirit in your heart against your husband. God says, I hate it. That is the New Testament standard. And him who covers his garment with wrong, with violence, means one who is cruel towards his wife. And sometimes husbands can be very cruel. You see, the barbarians hit their wives with their hands and throw vessels at their wives. But the more refined Greeks don't do such crude things. They hit their wives with words. And words can sometimes be harder than rocks. Only thing, the injury is not outside. The wife is not bleeding on the outside. But the hurt in her soul with one word, which can be more than a solid rock. God says, I hate it. I hate the barbarians who hit their wife on the outside, and I hate the Greeks who hit their wife on the inside. I hate them. Never forget that. God hates a husband who is cruel. In chapter 1, he said, I hate Esau. Well, here's another person whom God hates. He hates a man who is cruel to his wife in any way. Therefore, take heed to your spirit. And any person who has got 1% of the fear of God as a husband will really take that seriously if he sees that he can come under God's hatred because of cruelty towards his wife. Cruelty with words. Therefore, take heed to your spirit that you do not deal treacherously. She's a weaker vessel. And it's very easy to be cruel to a weaker vessel because we are stronger physically, stronger emotionally. Therefore, husbands think they can do what they like. And God says, all right, I'll have to reward you if you treat your wife like that. So take heed to your spirit that you do not deal treacherously with your marriage partner.